Well, how has your week been? How was week one of the readings and the homework and all the other fun stuff that Bib 438 brings your way?
There was a lot to do.
Yeah, there is. Heather, if you remember right from the other class, Bib 314, you probably thought the same thing. It was probably, gosh, this is a lot of work. Why they make Bible classes so hard? And I don't have the answer for that, but they do. Yeah, there's a lot of reading, a lot of material. And I think part of it is the unfamiliarity. When it's in your major, when it's up your interest alley, things seem a little bit more normal. But I don't know, being I don't ever teach in those other classes, I don't know if it is, in fact, but everyone tells me this is more work than any of my other classes. And I always say, I'm sorry, but I can't do anything about that. That's kind of the way it is. So yeah, because they do kind of watch out and make sure that we're keeping it very uniform so that people on campus, as well as at all the different satellites, are kind of doing the same thing. So it gets that FPU stamp of approval. So, but fair enough. I appreciate you saying it. I appreciate the honesty, and please don't hesitate. Anybody else? How is things going? Hey, Helen, I got to admit, watching you walk through the hallway there, it's like watching one of those old movies that I'm expecting a zombie or something to hop out, and it's like.
I'm sorry.
No, that's quite all right. It had a funny look with you moving through the hallway and the dark stuff going behind you, and going, oh my gosh, I've seen how this one goes. She's going to get swallowed up by a monster of some sort. But no, I'm glad you got to a good place and you're still alive. That's good. And we'll continue on. So good. Tonight we're going to be jumping into week 2. And week 2, last week we looked at first week as the beginning and some of the ancient story and how that began to build a sense of community for the Jewish people of the Old Testament day, and how that becomes kind of the launching pad or the foundation for the Christian movement that we have in the New Testament with the coming of Jesus. So all of our sections are going to touch on something to do with a sense of developing community, because that's one of the windows or one of the perspectives that we'd like to take as we look at the Bible and say, what is it? How is this that we're reading? How is it developing a sense of identity or a sense of community? And beyond the specific text or the part of whichever Bible part you're in, it gives us a sense of purpose of understanding how does this fit. And so today we looked at kind of some of the ancient stories in that shared story, the beginnings, and we move forward this week. We're going to be looking at the issue of the law. Law is a big piece, an important piece, I should say. It's not a real elaborate piece, but it's an important piece of the Old Testament story. Is how the issuing of law and then the evolving of law, because you might be aware that we start seeing commands but not really laws until the book of Exodus. And in the book of Exodus we start off with Moses revealing the 10 commandments. But as you saw in the video, I hope you've had a chance to watch the introduction video that I put together for you, because it does touch on a couple of things, included, that we're not going to ask you to read them all, but there are over 600 laws in the Old Testament, most of them in these first couple of books, a little bit of Genesis, mostly in Exodus, and again, mostly also in Deuteronomy. So those first 5 books that we often refer to, one of their nicknames for the first 5 books of the Bible, the Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That grouping often is called the books of the law, books of Moses, or the books of the law, or if you're coming out of the Jewish context, you might call that the Tanakh or the Torah. But those become kind of foundational for what we do. Now the trick is, and again, I touched on this I don't want to go over the video all over again, but I did touch on it in the video. The trick is, what do we do as New Testament era Christians? What do we do with all the Old Testament era laws? Are they still in force, or has something changed for us? Since we are no longer part of the ancient Hebrew community that those laws were first given to, do they still hold weight, or do they still have anything to say to us at all? And I think the short answer is that, yeah, they still hold weight, but it's a different type of weight for us than what it was when they were originally given. And their purpose of creating community is different for us today. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the distinctions, some of the differences, and how we can kind of wrestle through that so we don't get too wrapped up trying to follow all 600. Did you guys get a chance to watch that video, the A.J. Jacobs video on a year of living biblically? Okay, so he does a better job than I do. He's far more humorous than me, and I've never actually tackled that, trying to literally follow all the rules that we find in the Old Testament. So I think he does a much better job than I to kind of express the challenge that it is. But I think there's an easy fix, and he touches on it briefly. You probably caught it, that we need to kind of do a little bit of picking and choosing. But that's dangerous territory, because oftentimes when we just want to pick and choose, we pick the ones we like, we choose to throw out the ones we don't like. And that puts us in charge. That means that we are the boss of God's laws. And that's really not probably a fair place to put ourselves in, which is, again, that's not what Jacob said, but it's what often gets heard in what he said. But we can look at some of the Old Testament laws and we can kind of categorize them. These were ritual for the day, and we don't do those rituals any longer. Those rituals don't have a purpose in our modern society. Those were ceremonial. Those were part of the ancient Jewish people learning what it meant to be a people after God. And so they would have various days and patterns for those days, and those were regulated as to how they would do it. And we don't have to follow those either. But there are a lot of moral laws we like to refer to as moral laws. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference, but we can go after that, and we can look to those and say, what can we glean from them? Not that we have to follow them all, because that is part of what it means. The people who followed those laws were people who lived under what we call the Old Covenant. But for New Testament people, for Jesus followers or Christians, whatever you want to refer to, we live in what they call a new covenant. And this is something that Jesus opened up, and it's a different covenant, and the rules have a different role. So that was a far longer and more windy introduction to what we'll be doing tonight. So I'm sorry for that, but we'll get started. So how can we pray for each other? And in fact, who is our designated devotion/prayer for tonight? It's Heather. Okay, well, Heather, why don't we just ask the question, is there anything specific that we can be praying for each other for? And then I'll turn it over to you.
All right, well, one of my prayers came true with my technology working tonight with my Zoom, so score on that. Other than that, I found a prayer online that I wanted to share with everybody.
Okay.
So I'll start. It's the Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as a pathway to peace, taking as Jesus did this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that you will make all things right if I surrender to your will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with you forever in the next. Amen. And that's by Reinhold Niebuhr. I don't know how to say his last name.
You pretty much got it. Reinhold Niebuhr. But that's that the guy? Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, Reinhold Niebuhr. That's the name, almost like you find if you're reading names in the Bible. Sometimes it's hard to decipher them. But pretty good. Thank you very much, Heather. Yeah, that's a very common prayer. I mean, a familiar prayer to many, especially people who have been in recovery ministries and things like that, trying to sort out their lives. And that prayer, that pattern for prayer that Niebuhr put down is a good perspective clarifier. And so it's great. Good. Okay. Well, thank you, Heather. What I'd like to do next is go ahead and jump into our topic for this week. Again, this is the primary idea is law, but you saw on your Moodle that the topic for the week is not just law, but also how law fits with grace, which is another biblical concept, and one that it's kind of good for us to wrestle with how those two fit together. So before we start about the Bible part, I would like just to ask, again, being your future educators, this works out pretty well. How would you describe the purpose of rules in the classroom setting? Why do we have rules in the classroom?
To set expectations for the children.
Okay. So what's appropriate?
And also maybe have like a.
Go ahead, Helen.
Maybe like have a structure, kind of have like a routine going on with the students.
Okay, good.
Keep everyone safe.
Okay, right, because sometimes if they don't follow the rules, they're going to do something that might be harmful to themselves or somebody else. Right, good. Any other purpose that we have for rules in the classroom?
I was going to say to set expectations and then to have consequences for when the rules are broken.
Okay. Right. So, and that's so we come to understand that rules have a purpose in culture, in our society, whether it be in the classroom or in the world around us. And so when we hear things like there are 600 plus laws in the Old Testament, sometimes that sounds overwhelming. It sounds like we begin to, our eyes roll back in our head and we say, well, there's too many, I can't follow them, so I just won't try. But all the very things that you guys said were the purpose of rules in the classroom really can be translated into understanding a better understanding, a lens through which to understand the rules in the Old Testament, that they're doing the same thing. They're setting up standards of expectation. There are what is appropriate in relationship to one another, what's inappropriate in relationship to one another. It begins to set up all of the sense of what are consequences and how do consequences work out? What happens if we break the rules? How is restoration brought for someone who does break the rules? What does it mean for the community or the individual who breaks the rules? How do they interact with each other? And we see that that's exactly what's going on in the Old Testament as well, that God, through Moses primarily, the bringer of the law, was giving laws for how to interact. One, how do we interact with God in ways that are appropriate, in ways that will keep us from danger, in ways that would be different than the world around, and also how do we interact with one another in a way that is healthy for the community and is beneficial for the individual as he stays within the boundaries of what those classroom rules dictate in an Old Testament setting. Okay, so still staying in the classroom, can you, and again, we haven't defined the word grace yet, but is there a place for grace in the classroom when the rules are broken? What would you say is the role of grace once rules have been violated in the classroom? I know that's a hard question, isn't it?
I guess it would depend on the circumstance.
Okay, give me a scenario, Heather, where a rule's broken, and how does the rule breaker, how are they integrated back into normal society in the classroom?
In my personal opinion, if it had to do with safety, I would be more of a stickler on sticking to it. But it was something that's kind of in the gray area between two other kids, just talk it through with them and still let them know the expectations and not make it such a punishment, but more of a learning experience. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, sure it does. But yeah, come up with, go ahead and give us a specific scenario. Imagine a rule that you would consider a rule in your classroom that it gets violated. How then is the violator restored? And again, you can pick anything from no punching your fellow students to, to the type of behavior, whether it be talking or not talking at specific times. There's a lot of things that you could use. So any specific.
Is this on me or is this for anyone?
This is for you, Heather. Okay, I was asking for you for a specific. I'm sorry. I thought you were really forming up a grand idea here.
No, I'm like really trying to think.
Yeah.
I don't know, like if a kid were to, like, okay, I'm picturing like kindergartners. Like the rule would be to keep your hands to yourself.
Okay, good. That's a good one. Okay, and little Johnny, let's just give him a name because when I was a kindergartner, I had a hard time keeping my hands to myself. Okay, little Johnny breaks the rule.
Yeah,
Okay.
so if he hits another kid and the other kid maybe like tries to defend himself, that would be kind of a gray area. Johnny would be the one in trouble. But like I said, you wouldn't want to humiliate him. You would just want to lay down the law again, let him know what's expected. Maybe he misses some of recess, or maybe he needs to do like one of those books, like a scripted book we talked about, like social, emotional wellness and stuff. Make it a learning experience, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
And then
So there would be a consequence initially. Okay.
Yes.
So a consequence, he's gonna lose something. He's gonna have to pay for his transgression in some way. So he learns that he can't just keep transgressing. But you don't put him in the corner so he can't touch anybody else. You don't label him in a shaming way that you don't exclude him from the rest of the group. You have to reintroduce him somehow into your classroom. So that's where the challenge is, isn't it? That's where the challenge is, where rules can be used both as instruction, this is what we expect, and consequences can be part of that instruction as well. We don't expect you to punch your classmate. But also then, once this has been violated, and the punishment has been handed out, how do we allow for grace to come? Because their kids are going to break the rules. And so how do you begin to deal with rule breakers in a way that enables them to become better followers of the rules? That's the question, I think, for us as teachers. And again, I think it has its roots even in what's going on. And I like to look at it with teachers through that lens, that when we talk about laws in the Old Testament, that's really, in a sense, what God is doing. And I don't mean to oversimplify, but it's as if God is trying to create a classroom environment that we'll call his faith community. And in this classroom environment, there are rules that are to be followed. Some of them are for the safety and health of each of the class members. And sometimes it's just, this is how it works better. If you hit another student, then you're violating their personal space. If you're older than kindergarten, maybe you're copying off your fellow student, then you're taking something, their intellectual material, and you're stealing it from them. If you call your fellow students bad names, you're not actually harming them physically, but you are doing them emotional harm. So how do we set up those rules for the general health of the community or classroom? Is the same kind of idea that was going on here for the ancient Hebrew people as these rules begin to roll out. And again, they didn't come out with 600 rules, they came out with 10. And then we had a few more added on, and some were then kind of redone. Some were added to, then there's a few more. And by the time you get through the book of Leviticus, you're sick and tired of reading about rules. So if ever you want to pick up your Bible and start reading it cover to cover, I'll warn you, by the time you get to Leviticus, you'll want to quit. So we'll talk about how better to read the Bible later, but reading it front to back can be challenging because the first few books, there's some really rough patches where it seems like all we're doing is reading rules that may or may not apply to me anymore. Rules about how to do a sacrifice. You and I don't have to do that. Sacrifice is not part of our faith heritage. It was part of the ancient Hebrew heritage, but it's not part of ours. And so those kind of rules, ceremonial rules, ritual rules, we don't have to really process, but that was part of what was going on. And it was for the purpose of creating, as you guys all said, creating the proper expectations for what's appropriate, what's inappropriate, what makes a healthy community that is going to function well together. And that's really the point of the rules in our classroom. It's not so that the teacher can come off looking like a dictator, but it's for the overall health and well-being of the educational environment for each individual student within the class, so that they have the best chance of succeeding. And again, I think that's kind of was God's perspective when he was giving these laws. That's the same thing, that in the context of community, what is the best chance for each individual member of that community to be healthy, whole, and succeed. It would be following these rules to keep a sense of boundary for what's appropriate and keep us away from that which is dangerous. And so when we hear the word law and we read about some of the laws, it becomes hard. But yet, again, this chapter 2, and I think especially for teachers, it's easier to understand that becomes an important piece of what it means to develop a sense of community. So that's kind of where we want to begin in our conversation about community and about law. So just say this is going to be fun, okay? I know you guys are going to say this is not fun, but I'm going to let this be fun. I want to go to my share screen here, because when we talk about law, there's a couple things we often think of. That's not what I wanted. And when you think about the laws and the 600 plus laws, which laws does your mind gravitate toward? Anyone? I know, I just gave you the answer. I've got 10 commandments here. Okay, so we're going to talk 10 commandments. Have you all heard of the 10 commandments? Yes, good. Okay, we're going to play a game, and we're going to try to get all the 10 commandments, but we're going to do it as a group here. So we're going to go through, and I'll give each of you a turn, and then a second turn, and maybe even a third turn, to come up with one of the 10 that makes the original 10 commandments that we find in the book of Exodus, chapter 20. Now, I'm going to ask you to put away your phones. I'm going to ask you to put away your Bibles. I'm not going to say turn to 20 and let's read them. I want to just do a little brainstorming and see how many of the 10 we can come up with. So who would like to go first? And then we'll follow that pattern around. We'll give everyone a chance, then we'll go back a second time through. So who's starting off? Go ahead, Heather. You can just go ahead and unmute and go.
Thou shalt not kill.
Thou shalt not kill. Good. That's number 6. Where am I? Here I am. Not kill. Or technically, probably it says murder, but we'll go with kill for our purposes today. Good. Okay. Next, is that Julia or is that Cassandra? Who's going next?
I can go next.
Julia.
Love your neighbor.
Love your neighbor. Hey, great job. That is not one of the 10. Yes, and that's actually, it's interesting. We'll come back around to that, because when people asked Jesus what was the greatest of the commandments, he went off script and didn't go to one of the 10, but that is one of the commandments that's in the book of Numbers and Leviticus. It has to do with loving your neighbor, also loving God, but loving your neighbor is not one of the 10 commandments. Interesting. Okay, so we'll go, sorry, but good try, Julia. Great law, but not one of the 10. Go ahead, somebody else.
What about thou shalt have no other God besides me? I believe it. If I
Right.
did.
Yeah, that's very good. No other gods. Okay. No other gods. Good. Okay. And Helen, how about you? You got one for me?
Yeah, I just went. I can go again if I'm trying to rethink something.
It's okay, I got one.
Oh, you do? Okay, Cassie, go ahead.
Is it honor father and mother.
Yes. That's the number 5. Good. Look at us. We're wrapping through. Okay. So,
Can I guess one? Sorry, I don't know
yes,
this
Helen.
one. I believe it's thou shalt not steal. Or
Very
you.
good.
I find it just on top of my. I know it ends with not steal.
Yes, that's correct. That's number 8. Good job. Thank you. Okay. Back to the top. That'd be you, Heather. Do you have another one, or are we out already?
Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's belongings.
Very good. Okay, so the one not to covet, that is our last one. That's an interesting one, but we won't talk about that yet. Not covet. Okay, good. Okay, let's see, Julia. Yes.
Is one about respecting your parents?
Okay, that's the one we have here, number 5. That was already mentioned, I believe.
Oh, okay.
This one already has honor father and mother. So yeah.
Not sorry, Julia. Go ahead.
That's okay. Go ahead, Cassie. Give Julia a chance to think about it here for a second.
I was going to say
Okay.
be faithful in marriage.
That's a great law, but it's not one of the 10 commandments. Can you imagine? Well, it is actually. Yeah. The 7th one is to not commit adultery. So I guess that would be it. Yeah, you just put a positive spin.
Okay.
And I like to do everything negatively, so I went with the no adultery one. But yes, being faithful in marriage is exactly the same thing. It's just a different way of putting it. Very good. Okay, Cassie.
Actually, that was the one I had in mind too.
Okay.
So,
I spelled it incorrectly, so let me put an E in there. Yes. Okay.
Isn't there also one about not coveting your neighbor's wife?
Okay,
There was one
good.
about belongings and about wife, right?
Yeah, it's okay. This is an interesting twist, and it's kind of funny. I would say no. There's the covet is one. You don't covet their stuff. You don't covet his wife, kind of because actually 4,000 years ago, a fellow's wife was considered part of his stuff. They didn't live in a very modern age where we separated things like people from your stuff. So a wife was a possession of a husband. So, but depending on your faith tradition, sometimes those two get separated. Sometimes the first two, the having no other gods and crafting no images, are put together. And if you do that, then if you put those two together, then you need to make the covet one too. It's interesting, when Moses brought the 10 commandments down, they didn't have numbers. He didn't have bullet points. And so we don't really know exactly. We know that these are called the 10 commandments, but even this gets dissected and people argue about how you break up the 10 commandments. I would go with this, that there's no other gods before him. In other words, he has the priority. Second thing is to not craft images that then we would worship. Some people blend those two together and call them one. But I think that they are really separate ideas. And I think that's why this is the normal way of understanding this verse. But some have argued that it should be other than that. The third one has to do with not misusing the name of the Lord. You've probably heard that referred to. And the fourth one has to do with keeping the Sabbath and making it holy. And the one of the moral codes that we didn't get was this one about giving false testimony, or we should not lie. So no lying. We need to be honest. And so those become the 10 that we have, the original set that Moses brought down from Mount Sinai and produced and gave to the children of Israel as they were beginning their experience of becoming a people, a covenant people. Because before this, as you read through in Exodus, you saw that they were enslaved in Egypt and really were not much of a people other than they were an ethnic group. But as they came out of Egypt, God delivered them through the Red Sea, and they began to then form a community in the desert, and the commands and laws became part of the boundaries that God gave them to keep them, in a sense, being a little more whole. Now, again, I think it's interesting. Some of them are kind of hard for us to understand what's the importance. But again, if we see it in its historical context, we're seeing a couple things are really key. For example, the fourth command, the idea of keeping the Sabbath, resting on the Sabbath and keeping it holy. We think that, well, it means that we should all go to church on Sunday. That's not what it means. It really means that we need to set aside a day to reflect on what God has done and what God has provided. We need to set aside a day to recognize that God is our provider, because what we tend to do as people, and especially people in, say, 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, where survival was really a challenge. The easy thing to do would be to work every day. The easy thing to do, the temptation would be to try to produce enough stuff that somehow we're going to survive, and we're going to depend on ourselves. And so we will work all 7 days. Also, I think it's interesting that number 4, they were just being released from being a slaved people. And so for a slave, their only value is in their productivity. And so the unspoken rule would be that you are only worth what you can produce. And so the 7-day pattern that the Hebrews had, that God established, that even this rule that they are to rest on the 7th day, is setting up a new pattern for them, saying is more spiritually healthy for you to have a day to rest, reflect, and to take into consideration what God is doing. It is better for you to see God as your provider than to seek to be your own sole provider. And it is also important to see yourself and to see others not as simply by what you can produce, but to see yourself and to see others as being created in the image of God, and therefore different from the rest of creation. And so you have a special place in that creation. And this fourth rule, fourth law, the Sabbath law, kind of touches on all of those things. It really is a revolutionary law. Nowhere in the history of humanity had there ever been such a law that says, don't simply try to produce all you can. That to work time into your week to demonstrate your dependence on God. Other religions of that day or even since have often put in other kinds of sacrificial systems to try to please gods and what have you. But this is the only one that said, because of God's goodness to us, he is our provider, therefore we can trust him with it, and we can trust him, demonstrate that trust by not working on the 7th day. So it's a weird rule, but it really was a revolutionary rule. The other one I think is most interesting to me is that last one that says don't covet. And you'll notice there's one other thing that's interesting about this. There are no consequences listed for rule breakers of any of these. But the one to not covet means not only are you not to take what someone else has. Now, of course, that's number 8. Or unless, of course, what that other person has that you want is their spouse, then that would be number 7. Or if in having to take what that your neighbor has because you want it, you have to kill your neighbor, that would be number 6. Not only not doing those things, but not even wanting that which your neighbor has. Not falling into the trap of envying what your neighbor has, or somehow comparing yourself to your neighbor and feeling like somehow your neighbor is your enemy now because he has something that you would want. So this rule to not covet is an interesting rule, because you can break the rule without doing anything. I mean, really, All you got to do is open your Facebook and see your friend and having the best vacation ever, and all of a sudden you're wishing that you had the best vacation ever, and you wish you had their vacation, or you wish that your husband would treat you like their husband does, that they do this for you, or you wish you had their house because their house looks better in the pictures on Facebook than your house does. And all of a sudden you're coveting something, and it's not even, you haven't done anything except open your Facebook feed. So it becomes kind of an issue for us in the modern day, but also in the ancient day. Why would it be important? Anyone want to venture in to guess why this idea of not coveting would be something so important that God would include it in the original top 10 things not to do in order to create a healthy new community?
Is it because it leads to unhappiness?
Yeah, it's going to lead to unhappiness. And Heather, how would it lead to unhappiness? Go ahead and give me an example. I think there's a few different ways we can see that or say that.
Because you're not focusing on your blessings or the positive things in your life if you're only comparing yourself or wanting what others have.
Okay, good. What's another way that it can lead to some sort of sense of discord in the community? Not just your own personal happiness, but what are some other things that it could lead to? And I'm not asking you, Heather, I'm asking everybody else. You've already given your answer, and that's a good one. So we'll go on.
I'm not sure if it's kind of the same of what Heather said, but I was thinking that it would lead to being not grateful, or just not being thankful for the blessings that God has given us.
Yeah, sure it does. And it has to do with that. And I think that is kind of what Heather was saying. That's very similar to what Heather was saying. But that is a big key thing. Again, what happens when you want something that you don't have, that someone else has? What could be a scenario that would happen because of your desire for what they have? Okay, I'll do this because I'm bad. I'm a coveter, I guess. Hey, if I see someone, they've got something that I really want, I wish I had it, and I hate them for it because they have it and I don't, all of a sudden, seriously, I begin to hate them for it. Okay, so I'm a bad person, and if I didn't covet it, then I wouldn't have beef with them for doing absolutely nothing except for having what I want to have. And if my hate for them gets extreme enough, maybe I will do something to try to take it away from them so that I have it because I covet it, I want it, and so maybe I'm going to work to try to get it. And that leads to all kinds of bad things, which I could do if I try to acquire something from them. Maybe they don't want to give it to me and I want it still. So it leads to all kinds of things. It leads to a sense of distrust. It leads to a sense of division. It leads to a sense of individualism, where somehow my needs rank higher than the needs of the community around me. And it can lead to all kinds of failings, everything from stealing, from bullying, to beating, to killing somebody so that I can have what I think is due me. And if they have it, that's their problem, that they're the ones who happen to have it. We see this play out over and over in the Bible. We see this play out over and over all around us, don't we? That this is the beginning of just the breakdown of a sense of community, that I want what someone else has, and so now there's a division in the community. I just heard on the radio today there was, and I don't know, I'm guessing that he coveted something that he didn't have. There was an 85-year-old gentleman who was arrested up in the Bay Area after he robbed a bank. I don't know, that just seems odd. I know, I hear about people robbing banks all the time, but I don't usually hear about an 85-year-old dude going into the bank and saying, "Give me your money." And it just kind of, it's like, what is it about that? You know, why do you want to get arrested and go to jail? And you're 85, come on. But again, where does that start? It starts with this idea of there's something that I want that maybe is due me, someone else has it, and then it's a seed that is planted in coveting, and it turns into something else. So those are the original those are the original 10, and I would love to spend more time, but I want to spend more time on it, except to say that those 10 form the core. And as you read this week in Fee and Stewart, I know they will make mention of that Jesus alludes to all of these as well. And if we are going to look at ourselves as New Testament people, New Covenant people, then we see that those 10 were included, but not all 600 were. And there's a lot of Old Testament ones. Again, as A.J. Jacobs says, or as Fee and Stewart kind of guides us, many of the Old Testament rules we can kind of set in that category of that was a rule for those people at that time, because there was something that God was trying to form in them that was something of a healthy community. Now, if there's something that would help us be a more healthy community in that same message, then maybe it is something we should look at. But again, for most of them, especially the ones that had to do with rituals or ceremonies, we can set those pretty well aside because Jesus didn't say, this is part of our new covenant now. And so I want you to continue doing those. So, but again, how do those rules interact and how do we interact, whether it be Old Testament rules or the rules of a classroom is kind of the challenge. And even in Jesus' day, it was a bit of a challenge. Some of you might remember from Bib 3:14 that it is Jesus was asked in the book of Matthew, he was asked, what is the greatest of the commands? And I think it was you, Julia, who came up with that idea of loving your neighbor, because that's what Jesus did. Jesus went right to that one. There's a rule in Leviticus that talks about loving God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And also there's a rule in Numbers, I believe, that says that we are to love your neighbor as you love yourself. And so those are different laws, 2 of the other 600 that Jesus had to pick from. And he blended those 2 together to be what he called the greatest command. And again, that just goes to show that even 2,000 years ago, that was the question for people of Jesus' day. We can't do all 600 of these. So which are the ones that are the most important? And if we do those, that will help us understand where the other ones fit in the priority pecking order. And so Jesus put that as the lens through which to see if you are doing this loving your God and loving your neighbor thing, then that helps define how it is we can do the other rules or the other laws that we find throughout the Old Testament. So there, yes, so there. The other thing I want to say tonight, because you'll have a chance a little bit later, and I do want to touch on this because this fits in with our law and grace theme. And I think I mentioned it in the video. I'm always talking about it because it's one of my favorite musicals or plays ever. How many of you have ever seen the play or the movie called Les Miserables? It's very popular. About 10 years ago it came out. It had Hugh Jackman and Anne Hathaway and Russell Crowe. See, big names. And they put this musical that was very popular on stage, and they put the musical together for a film. And you'll have a chance to watch the opening scene, about the first 15 or 20 minutes of it, because the way the movie is portrayed, let me just touch on that for you and tell you why we're watching a little bit of a movie. If you want to watch a great movie, go ahead and watch the whole thing. I'm not going to require you to watch the whole thing, but it was a book written about 150 years ago by a fellow named Victor Hugo. And Victor Hugo wrote this story, and Victor Hugo wasn't especially a Christian, but he wrote an amazing story. And in the midst of this story, it's a story about a life that is transformed. And kind of the underpinning, the current beneath the story is a tale of a man by the name of Jean Valjean. And it's his life transformation story that the book and then the play and now the movie was written to describe. But the question underneath it all is how can people change? How can people's lives be transformed? We live in a very violent, very difficult world, and people seem to be so faulty that to expect perfection is probably an impossible expectation. So how do we work with this idea of rule and law? And also, how do we work with this idea of grace and change? For example, Valjean, the main character, played by Hugh Jackman, brilliantly, I might add, um, is pursued throughout the movie by another character played by, I just lost his name again. Now his name is Javert in the movie, um, and he represents the order or law of society. And part of the challenge is that because in his early days, Valjean was a rule breaker, he was a law breaker. He suffered and paid his price by going to prison. And then once he is released, he experiences something that brings change to his life. Now, the anti-hero, Javert, is constantly pursuing him because he figures once you're a lawbreaker, you're always a lawbreaker. And the tenor of Valjean's life is that no, once you've been touched by grace, you have the opportunity to change. That what you once were does not define what you will always be. And it's an interesting concept. It's again interesting from a non-biblical point of view of wrestling with that deep down. How is it that we as humans are we more likely to be conformed and changed by rules, following rules, or are we more likely to be changed, find transformation by experiencing grace when maybe we didn't deserve it? And it's an interesting question to ask. It's a biblical question. It's what the Apostle Paul wrestled with. It's what New Testament writers wrestled with. And it's what Victor Hugo, again, not because he was a Bible expert, but just because he was an expert of humanity, wrestled with. This is really our human condition. And so if you watch the movie, you will be drawn to many characters. Valjean in particular, he is the star of the show. And all the characters in his little universe. You will be rooting for him to overcome the lawman, even though the lawman in himself is not bad. But we're, in a sense, almost repelled a little bit by his pursuit of law and not being willing to allow for any grace in the world he lives in. So none of you have seen the movie? Gosh, you guys. I know you're going to say, I don't like musicals. That's fine. I don't like musicals either, but it's brilliant. And the story underneath it is fantastic. You will love the characters. You will cry. I cry every time, and I've seen it. I can't tell you how many times I've seen it, and I cry every time. I even cry sometimes when a certain song comes on, because I know what's coming next. It's terrible. I'm the biggest baby when it comes to this movie. But it's a great movie, so you'll be watching the first part of it. And again, in the first part, you'll be introduced to all the main characters. You see Russell Crowe's law character. You'll see Hugh Jackman's touched by grace character, and you'll see how the story at least sets out, and it raises up that question. There's a little article to read also to go along with it that talks a little bit from a biblical perspective, how those two aren't really warring against each other, but rather they fit together in a biblical way. And again, that's, I think, part of the Bible's answer to Victor Hugo's question about is it law or is it grace that makes the world go round? So let me see. I think I'm blanking here on what I'm blanking here on which one that is, but the number is, oh yes, okay, so that'd be in section 10. That's 2.10. That'll be the Law and Grace Forum. So there'll be a clip from the movie to watch, and then there'll be an article that you can click on to open that talks about law and grace in the context of that movie. And then it gives you a chance to do a little interacting yourself with those themes, especially after you've done some of the other work this week coming out of chapter 2, or week 2, both in the instruction from Fee and Stewart and the work along with the Bible readings of the week. Okay, let me see. Was there anything else I thought most important? Okay. Yes, 2 more things. I think this will be critical for us before we get started. One, I want to talk just briefly again about the 3 worlds model, to make sure that we're understanding that, and then I'm going to touch on a couple of things from Moodle, and then give you any time that you have for questions that I'll try to answer along with you. So, okay, back to my screen. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my share screen here, and I want to go back to this. Okay, so now clicking down to my 3 worlds model. And I only bring this up to talk one more time, just to make sure that all of our terms are understood, and that will be helpful for us as we go forward. Okay, so the 3 worlds model is, again, our biblical understanding of how we understand the Bible, how we approach the Bible, I should say. We do it from 3 different perspectives, and of course they are the literary world of the Bible. So what is actually going on? What the text? What kind of text is it? For example, last week when we were talking about Genesis 1, I know Sandra Richter in her video talked quite a bit about that idea of what kind of text is this? Is it ancient myth? Is it ancient history? Is it in poetry form? You know, all these things we need to understand what kind of genre it is. Because if we don't understand the genre, we won't be able to apply the proper rules for interpreting it. And so sometimes it will lead us to different interpretations, maybe even some false interpretations. So we understand what's going on, what type of material it is, and what's happening in the world of the text. How is the story being portrayed? How is this rule or law being explained? How is the poetry before us? How is it being rendered? What is going on in a literary point of view? Again, understand this. This is not the literal world. It is the literary world. So we're looking at it from a literary point of view. Second piece that we want to look at is the historical world. That's the second lens we put on, which is where we look kind of at the world behind the text. You know, what was the context that this comes into, both historically as well as biblically? How does it connect with other pieces of the Old Testament, for example? What's happening in this day? What is the author's perspective? Maybe what are some of the pieces of this story that in the historical sense they made perfect sense, but for our world it doesn't make sense anymore. I don't understand what they're getting after. And so to better understand its proper meaning from its literary world, we need to put it in the historical world to make sure that we are able to get to the meaning. What is the author trying to tell me from his historical perspective of this historical event? And finally, we get to, and again, those 2 fall into the category in Fee and Stewart chapter 1 of being what we call exegesis. And then the Fee and Stewart hermeneutic parts there in chapter 1 are what we could refer to as the contemporary world. And so this is the world as it applies to our world. This is the word or the text, how we apply it into our life. So this becomes our contemporary understanding. But if we don't know what it meant originally in its historical context, and we don't really understand what's going on in the literary world of that text, we will come up with all kinds of different, potentially different contemporary world applications. Some of them will not be appropriate. So we need to do all 3 of these, and that's part of, I know we did a little bit of, one of our sessions in chapter 1 was on that very thing, but just to make sure we're clear, when we talk about the 3 worlds, that's what we're talking about, is this process of working it out. So let me ask this. There is a story that Jesus told. And I'll use this kind of as an example of how it goes. There was a story that Jesus told. Maybe you've heard of it. It's called the story of the Good Samaritan. Have any of you heard the story of the Good Samaritan? Okay, I'm seeing some heads yes, and I'm seeing some heads no. That's fine. Okay, so in the Gospel of Luke, there is a time when Jesus tells a story. And so this becomes part of our literary world. He tells a story. And so we understand that this is in the narrative form. This is Jesus telling the story, not a story that actually happened, but a parable. So there is a meaning or a moral to the story that we're going to want to try to figure out that may or may not be obvious. And so as Jesus tells this story, he tells the story of a man who is in Jerusalem, and he's on his way to another city called Jericho. How many of you have ever been on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho? No hands being raised. Okay, how many of you have been anywhere near either of those places? How many of you think you could actually identify where Jericho is on the map? Probably not. Maybe Jerusalem, but maybe not that even. So when we come into this and we begin to look at the world behind the text, so historical world, or even the literary world, it might be good for us to know where are these places, and maybe how does that, is that a long journey? It's actually not a very long drive, but if you were walking, it would take you quite a while. But it's good to know a little bit of the background, what is going on in this story. Now, as the story goes, Jesus is telling, so literary world, this is a parable, which means it's a story that has a point. And our goal is going to be able to find that point. So historically, we know, okay, so Jericho, Jerusalem, and a road that goes between. Along this road, the man is attacked by bandits. The bandits steal from him, they beat him, and they leave him on the road nearly dead. Okay, now if I'm telling the story too slow, if everyone knows the story, I'll move forward much quicker. But that's kind of the story in a nutshell, that the man is in terrible shape, likely going to die, certainly going to die without help, and he's out in the middle of nowhere, and he doesn't have a cell phone because they stole it from him. That's what Jesus said. They even took his cell phone. No, okay, I was just saying that to see if anyone was listening. Jesus did not mention the fellow's cell phone because clearly he didn't have a cell phone. I know you're probably saying, what? No cell phone? How did he live without a cell phone? But that's not the point. Okay, so again, here we're asking questions that the author is not trying to tell us. So the question is not how did they live life without a cell phone? The question is, what is Jesus' point? So as the story goes on, so the man is there in very bad condition, probably about to die, and along the road comes a Levite. And then the Levite sees the man, crosses over to the other side of the road, and continues on, does not stop to engage or to inquire or to give any assistance. Then the next man who comes along is a priest. And the priest also does the same thing, sees him in his condition, but does not stop, does not offer, does not call 911 because he too does not have a cell phone. And then finally, there's a third gentleman who comes along, and he is mentioned as a Samaritan. Now, again, if we don't do our historical work, we're going to miss part of the point of Jesus' story. Because these three different characters that come along, Jesus gives defined names to, as in a people group, not individual names. But if we don't know what a Levite is, and we don't know in the historical world what a priest was, and we don't know maybe what a Samaritan is in Jesus' context, then we're going to miss out on some important pieces of what this passage might be about. So let me just walk it through real quick. For us, a Levite was a person, a religious person. He was someone who would work at the temple, whose life and job revolved around taking care of the temple and the ritual sacrifices which happened at the temple for the people of God to have their connection with God in place. So, good guy or bad guy in the historical context? Is a Levite a good guy or a bad guy?
A good guy.
Good guy. Thank you. Okay, thank you, Heather. Yes, a good guy. Now, in the historical context of priest, we understand a little bit more about a priest, even though we don't know what Levites were. We understand a little bit more about a priest because we have priests in our present day. And priests in our present day, especially for those who come out of Catholic traditions, will have some kind of context of understanding what a priest would have been in Jesus' day. It's different. It was a different priest, again, different faith. It was Jewish priests who, again, main point, were actually carrying out the sacrifices and doing the religious expressions, whose main goal was to be a representative of the people to God. Even today, in our Catholic brothers and sisters, think of a priest as being kind of their mediator. He's the one who does the sacraments and what have you, and extends that grace to the people. But again, it would almost be an inverse role of the priest in Jesus' day, that they would be not so much extending the sacraments or the grace of the sacraments to the people, but bringing the people and their needs and their sins to God. So they would be seen as the one who represented the people to God, instead of flipped it around, our view of priests being God's representative to us. But still, a good character, a bad character in the context of the history. Okay, somebody other than Heather. Cassie.
Oh, I
Good?
said good.
Yes, he's good. He is good. He is going to be a good character. For us today, we would likely say someone is coming down the road and he is the epitome of a good moral person. Okay, the man's going to get help. And finally, the Samaritan. In Jesus' day, a Samaritan was a person who was part of a people group neighboring the Jewish people. It was in a land called Samaria, just in between Galilee and Judah. And they were hated. They were despised. They were mistrusted. This was an ethnic division that would be probably very similar to how someone in the southern United States, say 70 or 80 years ago, would have seen the division between blacks and whites. This was mistrust. This was take advantage of. This was have nothing to do with them or their kind as best you could. And if someone from the other camp did come over to your camp, they would be endangered because they just didn't get along. And so Samaritans would have been considered in Jesus' day, historically, would have been considered the arch enemy, the great arch villain of the story. So we have two good characters and we have one bad character who come along the road. It would be like saying to us today, a man is on the road and he needs help, and Mother Teresa walks up. And Mother Teresa turns a blind eye to his need and walks on by. Next would be someone, say it's Billy Graham. Okay, Billy Graham's still alive, that is. And Billy Graham walks up and everyone thinks, oh, he's a great Christian man. He certainly will help. And Billy Graham sees what's going on and he walks by. And then third, there is a bad character. Someone in Jesus' day he would call a Samaritan. Someone in our day, maybe we would call him Osama bin Laden or something like that. Some use a jihadic terrorist comes up and we would say, oh no, the man's going to probably get, his last breath is going to be killed, taken from him now. But instead, there is a twist, because it is the Samaritan who comes along, who picks up the man, puts him on his donkey, walks alongside as he takes him to someone who can care for him, and then pays for his care so that the man might be made whole again. And so Jesus says this story, and in his historical world, if we don't know who a Samaritan, a priest, and a Levite are, we're going to miss out on a lot of what Jesus is making a point here. So what might be the point of this story? I think Jesus makes 2 points, and one is obvious even if we don't look at the historical world. What might that be? If you were going to try to take the moral of the story, what is the point that Jesus is making?
That there shouldn't be like judgment on a person beforehand.
Hey, you know what? Great job, Cassie. And that would be coming from the historical world. You might not have got that if we hadn't done the historical world aspect. You probably would have got the point that it's good to help people when they're in need, because that is an obvious take. You can almost get that no matter what the historical context is. But clearly, Jesus identifies the characters as such to make a point. If we don't know who they are, because we didn't do our historical world, we won't get the full point. So yes, it is right to be compassionate on people. It is good to be neighborly. And the third character is the one who we should emulate. He's the one who is the neighborly one. But the underlying point is exactly what you're getting at, that we shouldn't look at people and we shouldn't judge them by the title that they carry. We should look at people as more of a sense of being equals and not draw lines that divide us. Just because the man on the road who has been beaten is Jewish shouldn't mean he should be afraid of the Samaritan coming the way. And just because the man on the road is Jewish doesn't mean the Samaritan should not help him. It is instead saying, look, the Samaritan, who we think should be the villain, is actually the hero of our story. So all of our man-made divisions are really stupid. Now, Jesus didn't come out and say it that way, but that's really what he's saying, that rather than falling into the trap of dividing by our judgment lines or by our human division lines, those are all stupid, and they're really not the point of what it means to be human. The point of what it means to be human is to be a neighbor like the Samaritan. And of course, when he said this to those who were listening to him, they are scandalized. You know, they don't like the point of saying that the Samaritan was the neighborly one. When Jesus says, who was the neighbor? And they don't even say, oh, the Samaritan was. They can't pull themselves to say that. Why? Because they are judgmental and because they are dividing still over these petty ethnic lines. And so Jesus is really pulling out something far deeper inside our humanity, that we do that. We tend to divide ourselves by ethnic lines or status lines. And we create friends and foes. And in the story, he's really kind of saying that's all a load of crap, and it's not how we are to operate. So if we only get the simple meaning of the literary world, that it's nice to be neighborly and it's good to be compassionate on those who are hurting, that's a good message. But there's a far deeper message that we won't see unless we do a little bit of our historical work and then bring it into our contemporary world. How do we apply that even today? Because I think it's still applicable today. Okay, so I hope that's helpful. And maybe it's not, because we're going to keep doing this idea of the historical world, which leads then to a better understanding of our literary world, to our historical world to the contemporary world. And if we follow that out, we're going to get a better understanding of what the Bible is all about for us. And so that becomes kind of, I probably won't bring it up and show you that graphic anymore, anything, but I just want to make sure that we are clear that that's what it is, because we'll be dealing with that for the next month and a half as we move forward in the class. So for this week, okay, let me do share screen. I'm going to go back to share screen. I just came back. And before we do any questions and answers, I want to find my course. Here it is. Share. There's the one. Okay, so this week there's a couple things I want to touch on briefly. There's going to be a video to watch. Maybe you've already watched it. And there's going to be a kind of a quiz that comes along with it. It's Christine Hayes. She's a professor back at Yale, I believe. It's interesting. It's about that. But before you do the quiz, take a look at the quiz before you watch the video. If you've already watched the video, the quiz will be hard to do if you don't know what questions are coming. But there's nothing wrong with watching it, knowing what the questions are. So go ahead and make sure and watch or look at the quiz or print it off as you begin to watch the Christine Hayes video. It'll help you a lot. The other two assignments I want to just touch on, I think, are going to be helpful. One is this Literary World worksheet. Here it is. This will be one of the assignments that you will do. And I just want to point out, there's a couple things that help make this very easy, or at least easier, is that it's going to ask you some questions, and it's going to have you look at a set of text. It begins in Exodus, that's the second book of the Bible, beginning at chapter 33, verse 1, reading all through that chapter and into the first part of Exodus 34 up to verse 9. Now, as you read that, then you go down and you'll apply a couple of different questions. There's 3 questions here you're going to apply. The first question is just doing a little bit of literary world work. So, for example, and we have an example here of the first few verses of chapter 33. So your answer to question 1 is simply to continue the pattern. Okay, so you'll see they give you in 33, 7 through 11. This is the narrator speaking. But in chapter 33, verse 12 and following, the voice changes. And so all you're looking for is who is doing the voice in this particular section. Is it God? Is it the narrator? Or is it Moses? It's going to be one of those 3. And so just go through all the way through to chapter 34, verse 9. Again, the first 5 answers are already given to you. So your goal is to continue on doing this pattern all the way through the end of the reading. Again, chapter 34, verse 9. And then the second question is exactly the same thing, but a different question. It is asking questions of the text, not coming up with answers for these questions, but coming up with what's going on and what are some questions that this text kind of raises for us. For example, here, let's go with 33, verse 5. Why are the people called stubborn? That's a question. You don't have to answer that. That's a question that is just being raised because in the text, God speaks to Moses and says how, and he refers to the people that Moses is leading as being a very stubborn people. So the question that we are asking now, I want us to begin asking questions of the text. Why are the people referred to as stubborn? You don't have to answer it. That's just an example of a question. When we get down into verse 12 and the following verses, you'll be doing the same thing. Each section where either God, Moses, or the narrator is speaking, ask a couple of questions that maybe we would like to know. What are some things that we would ask? Deeper questions that dig us into what's being said. You don't have to come up with answers. There may not even be an answer, but it's just following this pattern of question asking of the text, okay? And then the final piece is this question number 3. And this is just asking a specific question. At the end of the reading, or very near the end of the reading, in Exodus 34, 6 and 7, God reveals his name to Moses so that it can be revealed to the children of Israel. And the question is, what is the impact of that name and what does it mean? So it's asking you to wrestle with that impact and a little bit of the difference it makes when you look at these different parts of the text in light of, oops, I didn't need that, in light of what we saw in chapter 32. So these are questions. This one's more got some specific questions asking you to dig in a little further. These are just more patterns. You know, what are the questions that you would raise to address what's going on in the text? And this is just asking, number 1, is just asking, which voice are you hearing? Is this the narrator's voice? Is it Moses' voice? Is it God speaking? So just to give a chance to do that. And then the second half of this page is not anything that you have to do. This is just some instruction about how sometimes Old Testament narratives went together, and what are some of the important things, like how events are ordered, or when things happen and you see either links or repetitions or oppositions. It's just a little bit of describing about how historical narrative worked and what are some of the key features of it in the Old Testament. But it's not part of the 3 questions that I'm asking you to elaborate on. So again, following the patterns and then answering that final question. That's what the assignment is about. Okay? Okay. Somebody had an assignment there. Okay.
So do we use that worksheet and just edit that document? Like we just plug in our answers from there?
You can, if it's, honestly, I don't know, Heather, if it's editable, if it is not edible, if it's editable, and if it's not, I would just, maybe just cut and paste those and just have those 5 as your starting point and just continue on and just follow the pattern on down.
Okay.
The other assignment I'd like to point out would be this assignment 2.5 and 2.6. There's a couple of maps that you can access here. They're Word documents. Just go ahead and download them. And then on them, follow the directions. You'll need to identify certain features on those maps. One map is going to be kind of a big picture of the Middle East at large. And so you'll use the maps, and again, you'll see the prompts direct you to them. You will use the maps that you'll find here that you're prompted to look at in your NOAB Bible, and then identify from these maps onto the maps that you have then printed off some of the key features, whether it be the map of Palestine, which looks for like the Jordan River, where is the city of Jerusalem, or the larger map that says, well, where's the Nile River, or where do we find Mesopotamia, or where do we find the Mediterranean Sea, just main features. And so you'll do that has maps. And then there are some questions. And again, the questions that will be asked are simple prompts. And again, you'll look, there's a certain section here at the back of your Bible. It identifies which section to read. And then from that, all the questions will be answered. It's only about 2 pages long as a reading. But if you don't have this, let me know, because you can do the maps without this Bible, but you won't be able to get the right answers if you don't have the right, maybe 2 questions or 2 pages. So if you don't have this Bible, let me know right away, and I will send you, I'll scan those pages so that you at least have the pages that you'll be working from, okay? But if you have the NOAB, you can find it because the instructions will direct you there. Okay, and then just upload the maps back to me, and you can do that most any way you want to, whether it be a photo of it or just an upload of the PDF. Either way works, and then answer the questions. And again, they're all in the prompts here in your geography questions worksheet. Okay, those are the kind of keys for the assignments for this week. There's a few other assignments that you can do, but I think they're even easier or more obvious in the way of reading it, so I won't get into those as much. But if you have questions either about last week's assignments or this would be a great time to ask them. Okay, well, hearing no questions, then I have nothing more to offer you tonight, except my prayers for you as you guys continue on. And I know this is a lot. There's a lot going on. Life is busy and life is full. And I'm not sure what's going on for our friend Maggie, but I hope that all is well with her, and I'll check in with her. If any of you have contact with her, please disconnect. Make sure there's not something going on that was a problem for her tonight, but I'll reach out to her as well. Okay. All right. Well, in that case, you guys have a great rest of your evening, and I'll post this video. Oh, by the way, Julia, did the video work out for you? Able to see last week's video?
Yes, I was.
Good. Okay. And again, it's not a bad idea if there's something that you're still a little bit hazy on, maybe to watch it again if that works. But I know it's really here, probably more importantly for those who are unable to make it to class. But I will again post it hopefully by tonight, but certainly by tomorrow morning, it'll be up but there's no requirement. If you've been a part of the class tonight, you don't have to endure it a second time, but it'll be there for you if you need it. Okay? All right. Well, you guys have a great week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. You guys have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Professor John,
Yes.
I wanted to tell you that I had the list for prayer for the rest of the courses that we have.
Yes.
Would you want me to email it to you, or do you want to write it down in a pin, or would you just want me to say it when class begins? Who has prayer that week?
Why don't you email it to me, then I'll just print it off and I'll put it in my stuff. That way I won't have to ask a question. I'll just say, hey, it's okay.
Perfect.
That'd
Okay.
be perfect. Yeah, if you email, that'd be actually ideal. Is that easy enough for you?
Yeah. I'm like, everything is mostly media, so it's
Yeah.
the new
Okay.
way to go around.
Great. Okay. Well, I appreciate it very much, Helen. Thank you very much.
Have a great
Okay.
night.
You too. Okay. Bye-bye.